Hello, Harry here. The following conversation is with a professor of applied sport and exercise science. He completed his PhD in 2007, entitled Sleep and Exercise During Acclimation and Acclimatization to Moderate Altitude in Elite Athletes.
We do look like we're in a prison cell. It wasn't me, I promise.
It's a weird room, isn't it? Charlie Pedlar is a knowledgeable man when it comes to altitude training.
If you go any higher, it just becomes impossible to train.
And after my recent visit to run in Font Romeu in the Pyrenees mountain range, I wanted to know more about running far up above sea level.
One of the outcomes you'd be looking for is a better running economy.
There is a video about my time there with input from Charlie, which is on the main Jog On YouTube channel and will be linked in the show notes. In particular, I wanted to see if we could answer this question. Was just 10 days enough to create any noticeable improvements in my running?
It's that breathing part that is so important.
Charlie gave some fascinating insight and during this conversation imparted a vast knowledge of the decades of research into the effects of training as a distance runner at moderate and high altitudes.
I'll always be interested in altitude and hypoxia and extreme environments.
For all Jog On videos, podcast episodes and the Jog On shop, head to thisisjogon.com for more and to support what we do. If you want to help this show out further, recommend to a friend that they check the Jog On podcast and videos out. So please, welcome to Jog On, Charlie Pedlar. For someone that's completely clueless and has no idea, why would an athlete be interested in possibly doing altitude training? In sort of layman's terms, very simply, what are some of the benefits one might see from altitude training?
Well, the whole premise behind altitude training is to try to boost the amount of oxygen carrying capacity you have in the blood. If you can do that, then it's like a superpower for endurance athletes. And sadly, we know about that with doping. You know that if you put extra blood into the system, you're going to be able to sustain much higher running speeds for longer periods of time. So it's really an attempt to get that through a natural means. And so what happens is when you go up to altitude, the air is thinner, there's less atmosphere pushing down on you that pushes the oxygen into your blood. So what happens is the body compensates by producing many, many more red blood cells. And it means then the idea is that when you come back down to sea level, is that you've got that extra capacity to be able to sustain fast running speeds.
One of the things people often that do think about altitude, who don't know much about it, just think altitude high, but actually it can be categorized into sort of low, moderate and high altitude. Roughly what are those boundaries? Do we have an exact meterage for what low, moderate and high are?
Yeah, various academics would define them in different ways, but if you get to above about 1,000 meters, then you're kind of into that moderate altitude zone. Realistically though, it's more like sort of 12 to 1,500 meters before you start to get an impact. But actually, there's a difference between sea level and 600 meters if you measure how the effect on your physiology. So even at those lower levels, there is an impact. But to get a proper altitude response, normally people are trying to get up towards around 1,600, 1,700 or around 2,000 meters altitude.
Absolutely. And is there a general consensus or something you found in your own studies that is that kind of perfect height? Because obviously the higher you go, the harder that training's getting. I guess there's a sort of a bit of a ceiling as well. This is just too hard. We're not going to get the benefit. So where's that kind of Goldilocks perfect?
It's going to be a little bit different between individuals, but there's definitely, once you start to get above 2.5 and certainly above 3,000 meters altitude, then it becomes too hard to train and sleep and recover and all of those things. And so that's really the realm of the kind of mountaineer and the kind of, people who are visiting altitude for short periods of time. So training camps, really, if you're living around 2,000 meters altitude, that's a pretty high camp actually. And you need to make sure, really importantly, that you're acclimatized. But yeah, that's the sort of sweet spot for endurance running, because like I say, if you go any higher, it just becomes impossible to train.
On the subject of acclimatization, seeing as we brought it up, how long does it take an athlete to acclimate? How long do they have to spend before their body starts to get to a point where they feel like they can, first of all, get the benefits, but also they can start to get their fitness where they can push themselves a little bit if they need to?
Great question. When you when you go into an altitude room or you travel straight to altitude, there's an immediate effect that your body tries to compensate for straight away. But that's we wouldn't call that an adaptation, that's more of a response. So that happens over the first few hours and your blood gets a bit thicker and your blood pressure in your lungs goes a bit higher and heart rate goes a bit higher, all trying to just compensate for this low oxygen. But then gradually as you acclimatise over a few days to a week, those responses will all settle down and then you start that slow process of building more red blood cells that can take several weeks to really have a measurable impact.
Yeah.
So acclimatization is it's not something it's quite a long-term process. And even if you look at depending on what you're measuring, some things will continue to adapt even up to 4, 5, 6 months at altitude. So and even across lifespans, because you get people living there that have very different physiology. Yeah, we're dabbling in very short periods of time at altitude, which I know you want to talk about. But yeah, it's a timeline that starts minutes to hours and goes on to lifespan.
In terms of the actual physiology, Charlie, and the science of it, could you use the word efficiency? Is the body trying to become more efficient at using less oxygen? Is that sort of also what's happening?
One of the outcomes you'd be looking for is a better running economy.
Yep.
Off the back of altitude training camps. Doesn't always happen, but that's certainly something that's going to help you, especially with the long distance events like 10K upwards. So yeah, a running economy is an important outcome.
I want to ask you, when I was in Font Romeu, my general approach, so I was there for 10 days, I trained about 8 days out of 10, had 2 rest days. Most was steady running. One was a tempo run that was pretty quick and hard, and one was a track session. And I want to draw your attention probably in particular to the track session. And the reps that we did, one of the big things I noticed was that when we stopped, when you do a lot of track work, as I'm sure you know, you get very used to knowing what your recovery is. Once you've done a 400 meter, you know about when your heart rate's coming down, when that breath, and it just wasn't happening as quickly. Is that a common sign and of my body? I was really breathing deeply and gasping at the end of this.
Yeah, it's that breathing part that is so important. And so and it goes back to the basic physiology of endurance running, in that you've got these 2 main systems that you use. One is powered by oxygen, the other one steps in to help, and when there's not enough oxygen available. And that's what's happening there. And what happens as a result is you get really high breathing rates to try and get as much oxygen in as you can, but you're having to rely on these anaerobic sources of energy, which means that you can't get on top of it. So your lactate goes up, and you get into this kind of acidosis state much quicker than you would normally. So interestingly, you notice it the most in swimmers because they've only got the limited time to breathe. It's really hard to do intense swim training at altitude, but on a running track as well, you're going to notice that between reps it's going to take longer to recover. So you have to adjust everything. It's just like stepping up the load, really, and so you have to adjust everything while you acclimatise, and it gradually gets better over a number of weeks.
And one thing I found is that maybe it's due to being slightly naturally lazier compared to your average athlete or something, but I was able to hold back a bit because I was aware that this could be a strain, this could be hard, so I did set myself a lot of steady running. Do you see athletes sometimes going there and pushing themselves too hard, and should they be going and sort of pulling back 10%, 20% of their normal training just so they don't get too fatigued?
Yeah, so I was just talking there about the lactate response and how that kind of lactate can shoot up much more quickly. So what we see is like an uncoupling during acclimatization, where your lactate response is going to be much higher for the same intensity, but then it comes back down again. Again, it depends on the individual because there's other factors at play as well. So if you're not sleeping well, then you're not recovering as well. And that can happen in the first few days at altitude because you get much more sleep apnea and things occurring in unacclimatized people. So if you're not recovering as well, then you have to factor that in. Our general advice over the years has been for athletes to sort of listen to their bodies, making sure that they kind of wait till they're ready before they push hard. So it means bringing that intensity down, letting your body acclimatise for the first few days at altitude. And I've always kind of encouraged athletes to ease off a little bit before they travel as well, so they're arriving there with a bit more of a recovered state, and the same coming back down after altitude, because you've got to kind of reacclimatise to sea level too. So backing off is really important. You
mentioned the word sleep there, and going back to 2007 when you did a PhD with the title being exercise during acclimation and acclimatization to moderate altitude in elite athletes, people often think of altitude training as the training part, the running hard, and we often forget about the fact that sleep and rest and recovery is a point. I'm sure that it's hours of conversation on what you found during that PhD, and so all that research. But very roughly, on the sleep side of things, did you find that sleeping at the same altitude, a higher altitude, lower altitude, what were the sort of results of that study?
So we did multiple studies. The number one thing is it doesn't affect everybody badly. But within a group of, say, 10 to 15 athletes, there's going to be a few, maybe 2 or 3, that really struggle to sleep on the first few nights. And what happens is, as you try to get more oxygen so you're breathing slightly higher, you're then expelling more carbon dioxide. So your body, what happens is you get what's called hypercapnic. CO2 in your body drops too low, And actually to compensate, you have to stop breathing for a minute. So you stop breathing for like longer than 10 seconds, and that's called a sleep apnea. And what you find is it's really interesting. If you ever lie next to somebody in a dormitory or in a bed, at altitude who's got the sleep apnea, their breathing is on, off, all night. So when we put people in altitude tents, some people are getting kind of several hundred sleep apneas occurring every hour consistently through the night until they're acclimatized. So we were able to document that in highly trained people. Other groups did that in Australia and other places around the world. So it's a really repeatable thing, but only for some people. Other people will need to go maybe another 500 meters higher before they'll have that same response. So so sleep can be a problem. And actually the problem with altitude tents, if you're using an altitude tent, is that because you're only in there for a certain number of hours a day, you might never properly acclimatize. So that sleep apnea becomes a chronic sleep problem. And then you can really end up with long-term kind of overtraining issues or underperformance issues, fatigue issues. So you've got to be quite careful, and finding out if you are likely to suffer from sleep apnea is quite important, I think, with altitude acclimatization if you're doing it properly.
So it's sort of quite an individualized experience, and there's no hard and fast rule for everyone. It sort of depends a little bit per person. Yeah.
The other thing that happens a lot is, you get just people's individual behaviors are important. So things like hydration. Like we know at altitude, you probably lose fluid at a slightly faster rate because you're breathing slightly harder. The air is a little bit thinner. Things evaporate more quickly without, you really noticing that you're losing fluid. And so also if you're coming from the UK and going to warm places like South Africa or Kenya or places to train like that, suddenly it's warmer. Dehydration is a risk. And so that can play into it too. And then, how people look after themselves, do they compensate for that? Maybe a little bit of sleep loss, and how do they compensate for the travel as well to get there? So it's not just the altitude, it's kind of other factors that come into it, means you get a lot of individual variability. So, yeah.
One thing I want to ask you, Charlie, is I went there as, an 18, 19-minute 5K runner, notches and notches down from this kind of elite level.
Yeah.
So if you take someone like me or someone who's running, a 24-minute, 25-minute park run, do you think altitude training could ever be a part of someone's training for the common person if they've got the finances to do it? Or do you think there are other factors that they should be looking at way before that, whether that be weight management, general fitness and training? Are there lots of other boxes you should be ticking, and this is just like the icing on the cake, if you like? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think you've got to be pretty committed to your sport to invest in altitude training. It can be expensive, and often you're kind of compromising on the running terrain as well, because mountainous areas don't always have enough flat trails.
That's very true. Yeah.
So that's why there's really well-known altitude training venues, because they're places where there's some flat land, like
and that high. Yeah.
The trails around the lakes in St. Moritz or the lakes, but high lakes are very good. Plateaus like in Flagstaff or in South Africa, where you've got flat ground at a high level. So there's only specific places where you can do that. But I think, for the general runner, they might have experienced it. I don't know if people have been on skiing holidays and things or been trekking, they've kind of experienced a little bit of altitude. But I think to invest in that at that level is probably just doing more training and doing it well at sea level is probably going to be more effective than those extra little gains they might get from altitude.
Yeah, that's just something I thought of. It's really interesting. When I was out there, I was surrounded by very high level runners, and as much as I was there to document as well, there was a part of me that thought that and thought, well, would my time be better invested in shedding the 5 kilograms I've got to lose? You know what I mean? Like, I consider myself a sort of hodgepodge distance runner. My abilities lie in the 400, 800, but just the classic thing of the loneliness of a track training and that existence is, I love big city races, and so I become distance really has been my focus. And so many people that were up there were distance, but I saw a couple of people who were obviously more middle distance based. Are the benefits stronger for those running longer distances? Would, like Usain Bolt or a 200 meter or a 100 meter, get any benefit from altitude training as well, or is it more impactful if you're a distance runner?
That's a really interesting question, because with the pure sprinters, they can actually run faster at altitude
because the air's thinner,
because there's less air resistance. So you can drop like half a second in over 100 meters just purely by the fact that there's less air to run through.
That's interesting.
So, but that's quite specific to those very high speed runners. Like whether or not they can adapt to a hypoxia, the low oxygen, they've probably got less capacity to adapt to that because genetically they're set up as sprinters. But we know with the middle distance group, some of them are coming at it with genes that kind of favour this aerobic adaptation, and they get all their power and their speed from aerobic adaptation, whereas some of them are getting it more from the anaerobic, from that kick, or from that, and the middle, and that's why the middle distance is so fascinating, because some people are going to benefit from altitude training, let's say, whereas others might not get so much benefit from it. So I mean, it's that mixture, meshing of those different abilities in the middle distance that makes it you can come at it from different ways. But
the thing about altitude training, I wonder, is that say take athlete A and they go away and they do 4-5 months of dedicated out, they do a lot of altitude training, but once they return to the UK and they're doing some races, for how long would those benefits remain before they're disappearing again?
Well, the kind of traditional approach to altitude training means that you try to get these increased red cell production. And now when you come down from sea level, that's all going to reverse. And there's going to be like a decay phase where you gradually lose those adaptations that are, because we're efficient in terms of human physiology, how we adapt to the environment in front of us. There's no point in having excesses in the system. So you're going to lose it. Now, so if you think about the life cycle of a red blood cell, is about 3 months. So it's probably, by the time you get to that stage, there's going to be negligible specific altitude adaptations left. But saying that, if you look at the whole season, the whole year of training, you've got different stimulus at different times. You might have some heat acclimation, you might have some altitude acclimation, and you're left with the whole athlete who's been through that whole, all of that. So there's mental adaptations as well. So I think it's a bit reductionist just to look at those red blood cells and think that's all there is to it.
Got you.
I think there's much, you've got to look at the whole picture. And so 3 weeks of altitude, or even a week of altitude training, can have benefits that make you a better athlete and learn about your body and learn about your physiology that can last the whole career. So I think it's more than just that. But yeah, if you're looking for detecting those changes that might have occurred at altitude, they're pretty much going to be gone after 3 months after being back at sea level.
Understood. So if someone was, if you were as a coach was timing it perfectly for athlete A, say they've got London Marathon, is there sort of a perfect amount of time from when they land back at the airport to, because obviously you need a bit of recovery as well, that then you execute the race? Would someone time it like that?
Well, so there's been two schools of thought traditionally. One is that you fly in and race almost like the next day, so that you can really feel that extra power you might get from a bit more oxygen pressure. The other thought is that you come back, sort of reacclimatise, get used to running in this kind of thicker air, which it sounds crazy, but it is noticeable when you come back down from altitude. It can feel more humid. Running mechanics changes slightly to then reacclimatise and then compete is another way of thinking about it. But if you look at something like, there's a famous case in my head of a triathlete who lived at altitude all year round, and he would just travel to triathlon competitions to compete and then go immediately back up to altitude again. Wow. So he was trying to maintain his acclimatization the entire time, and that was his normal. And he was, multiple world champion. So it can work really well to do that kind of approach as well. And
in a sort of perfect scenario, is it sort of just like the more the better? Like if I just went and lived in Font Romeu, lived in St. Moritz, is that kind of the ultimate thing? Is there any benefit bouncing between the two at all and sort of spending half your life, or?
I would say we know that success in endurance performance is related to completing your training. Like when an athlete athletes will relate to this, that if they're healthy and well and they can train, they know how good they can be. It's just about consistency of training and for a long period of time. And so the more cycles of training they can kind of string together, the more likely they are to succeed. But going to altitude can be a risk in that sense, in that, we talked about like backing off a little bit and then backing off when you get there. So you've got a window of time where training is inconsistent because the terrain is different. You might not, you might pick up an injury or something, or there's possibly a slightly higher risk of getting sick or overtrained at altitude as well because of those changes that have occurred. So I'd say, far less risky would be to be at altitude all year round, but it's obviously practically difficult to do that for UK students or whatever that are traveling. You just can't spend that much time or money overseas. But we know that once athletes get to like Paula Radcliffe famously, had permanent altitude residence. Once you hit a certain level and you make that life change, then I think it makes sense for athletes to do that.
Is altitude training a fairly recent concept, or is it something people have been doing for decades and decades? You go back to Seb Coe days. Is this something they were doing, or is this a more recent adaptation to training?
So the earliest research work around this was in the 70s, but it didn't really take hold as a mainstream thing more until the kind of 90s. Levine and Stray-Gunderson devised the live high, train low model, where you kind of drop down from altitude to do your hard sessions and then go back up again. Yeah, and since then it's probably grown and grown. Now we're so aware of the effects of altitude. Famously, like the Olympics in Mexico City was where it was really, really clear that people that were acclimatized were going to do better, and events like high jump and sprint were faster because the air was thinner. So it really brought home the effects of that. And now there's altitude camps popping up everywhere. So I think it's become much more mainstream, but it's an interesting history.
Yeah, absolutely. I find the whole concept fascinating.
And the East African dominance as well. And we know there's different theories on why the East Africans are so strong in running, but there's certainly an altitude element to that part of the world in terms of the kind of high altitude plateau that they live on, and the genetics associated with that as well that may confer an advantage. So there's that side of it as well, which is obviously quite compelling and drives other athletes to head off to altitude, see if they can get some of those benefits.
100%. Charlie, this might be a dodgy question. I'm not quite sure, but I did go to the gym. I did 3 gym sessions whilst out there. Again, didn't push myself too hard. And anything I did that was a bit more cardio based, a little bit of cross training, a little bit on the ski erg and stuff, I again noticed it very quickly. In terms of the actual strength training, would anyone adapt that at all? Would you take it slightly easier because the muscles might be more fatigued? Is there any kind of study between the actual strength conditioning and being at altitude, or is it all kind of based around that cardio base and that's where you get the benefits?
My immediate response is that you can pretty much carry on with your normal sea level strength training program at sea level and altitude. Now, you're right to think about that whole training volume and how you might adjust things, but generally altitude is not going to impact on that too much. Yeah, that's the kind of short answer. There is a school of thought that doing strength training in altitude can offer an additional benefit because it does stimulate some proteins to be expressed that might help with strength as well as with endurance, but it's quite a thin evidence base, I'd say, around that.
Interesting.
So
yeah.
There are companies sort of selling altitude training facilities to like rugby teams, football teams, that sort of stuff, but it's hard to justify from a research perspective. There's not a whole lot of evidence that it works,
as there is with the actual endurance training and its the effects of altitude.
Exactly.
So I think it probably builds us to one of the main questions I had for you today, Charlie, which is that I spent 10 days in the Pyrenees in Font Romeu, had a brilliant time, first time ever really properly altitude training. I'd been running while skiing and had the effects of it and was kind of aware I'm running at altitude. And that training varied from running around a lake at 1,400 meters, that was the lowest we went, up to about 1,900. I never quite popped to 2,000. One of the guys went off and did a training run. I know he went over 2,000. And be as absolutely honest as you like. And from the sounds of this, I already feel like maybe I know where it's going. But is 10 days enough to see anything at all, or do you think at that point it's just not long enough?
Well, you would certainly see those acute acclimatization effects, so over that first week, but then just as you're starting to kick in that longer, slower adaptation effect, it's time to leave. So it's going to be limited. I mean, it's probably not completely useless, but it's certainly in terms of the tests that we have to measure a difference, you wouldn't expect to see anything after 10 days really. Traditionally it's been that 3 weeks, like 21 days, that's been banded around as kind of a minimum altitude training time to get a measurable effect anyway.
Understood.
But our tools are not necessarily that great at measuring the thing, so it's also about how you're feeling and things that we can't necessarily pin down as one physiological system. So if you're running better off the back of it, you could well attribute that to a stint at altitude. So it's so individualized.
Yeah, absolutely. But potentially about double what I did, so maybe 21 days plus as that sort of minimum line would be certainly a more measurable adaptation.
Exactly.
And those 10 days I went through are, in your opinion, probably more likely that my body was just starting to get used to what's happening, and I was just maybe beginning that process, is what you're saying, of starting to acclimatize and maybe have some physiological adaptations. But
exactly,
just the very beginning.
Exactly. And I think the other thing, like we mentioned the sleep, because you could have a disaster and actually come away in worse shape because you haven't been you're sick, you haven't trained well, you haven't slept well, and you come back down and say, I'm never doing that again. And some people have that experience first time they go to altitude, but then they go back again and they're better prepared, and there's potentially a kind of a memory around like reacclimatizing a bit faster the second time you go. But also there's some interesting research as well around how your diet affects acclimatization. So one study recently just showed that if you double your fruit and vegetable intake at altitude, that can actually facilitate some of the adaptation that occurs, because we get more inflammation and we get more oxidative stress at altitude, and that can be impacted to a degree with diet. So that was a really interesting study that they actually managed to kind of facilitate that adaptation. Equally, if you go to altitude with an iron deficiency, then you're really unlikely to get a successful increase in red cell and hemoglobin production because you haven't got the iron, and that's particularly important for females. So those sorts of things, as well as the sleep, altogether can really impact on whether or not you come away feeling better or worse after an altitude camp.
Fortunately, overall, I think I had a pretty good experience. But sleep was weird. Dreamt a lot of dreaming. And just definitely felt different. But overall, I think it was an okay experience. I had one run where I just hit the wall, and it was a steady, slow run. And I just needed the rest to be a rest day. So it got flipped from there into rest.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it was generally a positive experience. But it fascinates me, the idea of spending a longer time and, a month. If I could do 4 weeks, that would be really interesting to see what that felt like and what I could do off the back of it, I guess.
Definitely. I think Font Romeu, there's enough different runs and things to do there maybe to keep it interesting for a month or so, but then you probably need a change as well. And
you made a really interesting point, because I had this same question, which was, why is there only a few names bandied around as these places that people go for? But it's that ticking those boxes, that perfect storm of enough kind of flat areas, plateaus, lakes to run around, plus the altitude.
Yeah, and that's another interesting point. I mean, you could talk all day about altitude, but I think interesting it's also about the climate, because if it's colder, which often is at altitude, then you might lose some of the benefits of heat acclimatization as well. So there's more and more evidence that you can get comparable effects from hot training, from warm weather training, as you can from altitude training. Now, if you can put the two together and get the benefits of both, then it might be even better again. So, and that's where traveling further afield, like southern hemisphere, to your Kenya or your South Africa, might be better than going to colder places where there's a really short season and it's really windy and all those things in the mountains. That plays into it as well. Yeah.
Again, I'm sure it's a huge topic, but heat acclimation, is that having a similar effect because it's to do with you're having to breathe harder? Like, what exactly is happening that heat acclimation might have some comparables to altitude?
Yeah, so good question. So when you are exercising in the heat, you're sending a lot more blood to the periphery to help you cool down. You kind of naturally need a bigger blood volume. And then your heart has to work a little bit harder. So to help the heart, you get a plasma volume expansion, and eventually that normalizes with a blood volume expansion. So there's this idea that you do get some cardiovascular. Well, you certainly get some cardiovascular benefits, but they might also be exactly the same really as you get at altitude, because you're trying to support that system, support the oxygen delivery, but it's all about thermoregulation. So it's about keeping cool. So there's a comparable adaptation that might be occurring with heat is occurring with altitude. So,
well, Charlie, it's been absolutely fascinating to talk to you. A really interesting and just a pleasure to hear about it. And also just to give the video some more context that I'm putting out on the main YouTube channel about my 10 days at altitude. It gives it a professional element and actually an educated voice that I cannot bring other than just me blabbering on in the mountains isn't enough, in my opinion. I want to give a bit of education with it. So the final question to you really is, in your professional career, you've studied altitude and training and moderate altitude to high altitude a lot. Is that something you're going to continue to work on, or are there other facets of your career now that you're looking at studying and working on?
I think I'll always be interested in altitude and hypoxia and extreme environments, but it is sadly less and less of what I do in my work. It's more of a kind of, my eyes will glaze over when I start talking about all the altitude camps I went on and my PhD work and all that stuff. But some of it, elements of it, we're still doing. So we're doing some work in the military around sleep and cognitive function. We're doing a lot of work on blood biomarkers in athletes, and that relates to that nutritional element that I was talking about, and the iron status element. We're doing a lot of work on female athletes and specific considerations there. The area is still moving forward, but there's maybe not a huge amount of resource going into endurance athletes at altitude. There's not people throwing money at that, so we have to follow the kind of research funding and that kind of thing. But yeah, that's where we're at. at the moment.
Brilliant. Charlie, well, I wish you all the best with your future career. You're a very knowledgeable person. It's been absolutely fascinating to talk to you. And thanks very much for the advice.
Oh, you're welcome.
Make sure to check out the video of my time altitude training with input from Charlie on the main Jog On YouTube channel. It will be linked in the show notes. We produce a podcast and videos to connect people through a love of running and adventure. To find out more or to purchase our running kit from the Jog On shop, check us out at thisisjogon.com. I'm Harry Morgan, and this is Jog On.